Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something a little odd, a little bleak, but hopefully soothing enough to drift off to. So dim the lights, tuck in, and let's talk about dead kings. Specifically, why some of them ended up buried right next to people they absolutely hated in life. Because apparently, even in death, medieval monarchs couldn't get away from their drama. Now, usually when you picture a royal burial, you might imagine grand tombs and cathedrals, covered in carved angels, with candles flickering gently nearby, a peaceful eternal rest. But in reality, medieval royal burials were messy, political, and, well, a bit ironic. Some kings didn't even get the luxury of being laid to rest among adoring subjects. Instead, they found themselves spending eternity side by side with the very people who betrayed them, murdered them, or made their lives miserable. It's the medieval equivalent of being forced to share a dorm room with your worst enemy forever, only with more incense. Let's start with one of the more famous cases. England's King Henry VI. Poor Henry. He was one of those unlucky monarchs who probably should have been allowed to just read poetry in a corner, but instead ended up stuck in the Wars of the Roses. He was gentle, pious, and unfortunately, mentally unstable, which, if you're running a violent, feuding kingdom, is not an ideal resume. Henry was constantly overshadowed by more aggressive nobles, and he had the bad luck of being married to Margaret of Anjou, who was basically doing all the ruling for him while he had episodes of catatonia. Eventually, the rival House of York overthrew him, and Edward IV had Henry conveniently removed from the picture. By removed, I mean locked up in the Tower of London, and then mysteriously dying there in 1471. Which, yes, is code for probably murdered. And where did they bury poor Henry VI? Well, not exactly with friends. He was buried at Chertsey Abbey first, but later his remains were moved to Windsor Castle, where, awkwardly, he ended up interred not far from Edward IV himself, the very king who almost certainly ordered his death. Imagine the eternal side-eye between their tombs. Of course, Henry isn't alone in this. The Middle Ages had a whole buffet of monarchs who couldn't escape their enemies, even in the grave. Let's drift across the channel for another example, France. Louis IX, also known as St. Louis, actually had a fairly saintly reputation, as the name suggests. But his grandson, Philip IV, the so-called Iron King, was a much colder character. This is the same guy who basically destroyed the Knights Templar because they were rich and he was not. When Philip died in 1314, he was buried in the royal necropolis at Saint Denis, just north of Paris. Which sounds fine, except this was the same place where many of his political enemies, rivals, and even some rebellious relatives ended up buried too. The Capetians had this habit of just tossing everyone into the same dynastic resting place, whether they liked each other or not. So Philip had to spend eternity rubbing elbows with people he had imprisoned, bankrupted, or burned at the stake. Cozy. And honestly, that's the recurring theme here. A lot of these awkward burials weren't out of spite. They were just out of tradition. Families were buried together. Dynasties were buried together. And if you happened to hate your cousin, your uncle, or your political rival, well, too bad, you still had to share a crypt. It wasn't just kings either. Queens and consorts often got dragged into the mix. Think of Isabella of France, sometimes called the she-wolf of France. She was married to Edward II of England, a man so spectacularly bad at being king that his barons basically staged a coup. Isabella herself eventually turned against him, teamed up with her lover, and had Edward deposed. Edward II supposedly died in Berkeley Castle in 1327, under very murky circumstances. The famous, and probably fake, story is that he was murdered with a red-hot poker. Now, where's the irony? Well, Isabella herself was eventually buried in the same royal resting places as her Plantagenet in-laws. Meaning, yes, she had to lie forever linked to the dynasty she helped violently upend. Imagine the ghostly family dinners. So, the question is, why did this keep happening? Why were kings and queens routinely buried next to their enemies instead of, in their own peaceful tombs far away? The answer is pretty simple. Symbolism. Medieval monarchies loved the idea of dynastic continuity. Even if everyone hated each other, the burial sites were meant to show strength, unity, and tradition. A family vault said, "Look, We're all together, no matter what happened. It was like a PR stunt that never ended. And also, land was expensive. Cathedrals only had so much prime burial space. If your family had a vault in St. Denis or Westminster Abbey or some abbey church somewhere, that's where you were going, whether you liked your cryptmates or not. Let's float a little further north now into Scotland, where Robert the Bruce had his own burial drama. Bruce was famous for beating the English at Bannockburn in 1314, but he died of an unpleasant skin disease a decade later. His body was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. But his heart, yes, his literal heart, was removed and taken on crusade by Sir James Douglas, supposedly to be buried in the Holy Land. Long story short, that plan failed, and Bruce's heart was eventually buried back in Scotland. But here's the awkward bit. Dunfermline Abbey was also where several of his rivals and enemies ended up buried, including Edward Balliol, another claimant to the Scottish throne. So even Bruce, Scotland's national hero, had to put up with some bad company for eternity. And that's really the sleepy punchline of this whole story. Medieval burials weren't about personal comfort. They were about lineage, politics, and showing the world that the dynasty was still intact, even if everyone in it had tried to murder each other while alive. One of the most famous cases is, of course, Richard III. Yes, the My Kingdom for a Horse guy, Shakespeare's crooked-backed villain. Except in reality, Richard probably wasn't as cartoonishly evil as people think. He was a politically ambitious Plantagenet, sure, but so was literally everyone else at the time. The man just had bad PR. After being defeated at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 by Henry Tudor, Richard's body wasn't exactly treated with royal dignity. His corpse was slung over a horse, shown off to the public, and then buried in a pretty unceremonious grave at Greyfriars in Leicester. Not even a nice stone coffin, just a hurried pit in a monastery yard. But here's where it gets ironic. That monastery yard was eventually built over by, of all things, a parking lot. Richard spent centuries lying under people's cars. And when his remains were rediscovered in 2012, DNA testing confirmed him. The awkward part? He ended up being reburied in Leicester Cathedral, but still within a realm dominated by his old Tudor enemies. The Tudors literally built their dynasty on his defeat, and now he rests in their shadow. Not quite next to Henry VII, but close enough for eternal irritation. Let's drift to Burgundy now. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was another man whose death turned into a burial nightmare. Charles had this obsession with expanding his lands and acting like a king, even though technically he wasn't one. He fought constantly with the French crown and with neighboring states. In 1477, he died at the Battle of Nancy, where his body was left in the snow and half-eaten by wolves before anyone even realized it was him. When they finally buried Charles, they put him in the ducal tombs at Bruges, which sounds elegant, except yep, you guessed it. The same vault also contained the remains of dukes and nobles who had despised Charles's reckless wars. In life, they had tried to restrain him. In death, they were forced to put up with his bones. Now, if we head into the wonderfully strange world of the Habsburgs, things get even more crowded. The Habsburgs had this charming family tradition of splitting up their bodies at death. Hearts in one place, intestines in another, and the rest of the body somewhere else entirely. Because apparently one burial location just wasn't enough. So, for example, Emperor Ferdinand I, who ruled in the mid-1500s, had his body buried in St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague, his heart placed in Vienna, and his guts stored in yet another chapel. And the kicker? In every one of those burial sites, he had to share space with people who had been his political rivals, distant relatives who undermined him, or bishops who probably resented him. It's like being permanently divided into awkward dinner parties. And if you want an even juicier Habsburg example, there's Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He abdicated his thrones and retired to a monastery in Spain, where he died in 1558. Charles was one of the most powerful rulers in European history. He basically ruled half the known world, but he was also constantly at war with France, with the Ottomans, and even with Protestant reformers. When he was buried at the monastery of Yusti, his tomb ended up packed next to monks and clergy, many of whom had hated his endless wars. The man who once ruled an empire on which the sun never set spent eternity with irritated monks who probably just wanted some peace and quiet. Of course, if we're talking eternal awkwardness, we can't skip the Spanish kings. The Escorial, near Madrid, is this giant monastery palace complex built by Philip II in the 1500s. It became the dynastic mausoleum of the Spanish Habsburgs. And boy, is it crowded. Philip II himself, stern, gloomy, deeply Catholic, is buried there. So are his father, his sons, his wives, and, awkwardly, a whole collection of relatives who had spent their lives undermining each other. It's basically the world's most uncomfortable family reunion. Except it never ends. Sometimes, though, the burials were even more deliberate. Monarchs literally being laid to rest with the bones of their enemies. Take Harold Godwin's son of England. After his defeat at Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror supposedly had Harold buried right on the battlefield itself, possibly even among the Norman dead. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. Harold would never escape Hastings. His neighbors for eternity were the very men who had cut him down. Ironically, William the Conqueror didn't get much better. When he died in 1087, his body was buried at Caen, in a church he built on confiscated land. At the funeral, a local man even stood up and shouted that William had stolen his family's property. So William the Conqueror was buried in a church of stolen ground, surrounded by monks who weren't exactly thrilled about it. Not the restful afterlife he might have imagined. Frederick Barbarossa, the great Holy Roman Emperor, fared no better. He drowned in 1190 on crusade, and his body was awkwardly preserved in vinegar. Different parts of him were buried in different places around the Levant, which meant his remains ended up scattered among people who hated him just as much as those who followed him. And of course, King John of England, forever the family disappointment. He died in 1216 and was buried in Worcester Cathedral, where his Plantagenet relatives could silently judge him for eternity. A crypt full of cousins who thought he was a disaster. Even in cases where kings tried to make a statement with their tombs, the irony persisted. Edward I of England styled himself Hammer of the Scots, and was buried with that title carved on his tomb in Westminster Abbey. But of course, Westminster Abbey was full of nobles and royals who had resisted him, so his big bragging epitaph was undercut by the company he was forced to keep. Sometimes the eternal family reunions got downright spicy. Eleanor of Aquitaine was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, right next to her husband Henry II, whom she had once rebelled against, and her son Richard the Lionheart, who had fought wars against his father. Fontevraud isn't so much a family resting place as it is a crypt-sized soap opera. Other times, monarchs weren't even buried with family. They were buried with strangers who symbolized their failures. Richard the Lionheart's heart was buried at Rouen, the very city he had once brutally sacked. The citizens of Rouen literally got to keep the heart of the man who had destroyed them. Henry VIII, of all people, ended up in a half-finished vault at Windsor, jammed in with Jane Seymour and, later, Charles I. So England's tyrant king shares eternity with a martyred king he would have probably loathed. Even Napoleon couldn't escape the irony. First buried on St. Helena, guarded by British soldiers who had defeated him, before finally being reburied in Paris. His afterlife began in a trench, under the watch of his captors. And so, what's the lesson? Medieval kings could control armies, rewrite laws, and conquer nations. But they couldn't control their final address. They were props in dynastic theater, placed wherever tradition or irony demanded. Sometimes next to wives they hated, sometimes next to rivals who killed them, and sometimes under a parking lot. So maybe it's comforting. Even the most powerful people in history ended up stuck with eternal roommates they didn't choose. Kings, queens, dukes, and emperors, all lying silently in their crypts, glaring at each other across slabs of stone, trapped forever in the awkward family reunion that is medieval burial tradition. And on that note, let yourself drift off, hopefully to a more peaceful rest than they got. Sleep well, friends.